Okay, and welcome to Take Charge for April of 2014. Our speaker today is Maria Ricupero. Maria is a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator with 14 years of experience working in cardiac rehab. She has a Master's of Health Sciences degree in Nutritional Communication from Ryerson University. Maria currently works at the University Health Network in the Cardiovascular Prevention and Rehab program, where she provides individual nutritional counseling as well as group facilitation for patients and their families. Maria is well published in peer-reviewed journals and is frequently requested to speak at professional conferences and to various community groups, and also to our Take Charge session, where she's helped us out a number of times, for which we're very grateful. Maria also shares her expertise with media, and she's in print and radio and television all the time. So we're very fortunate today to listen to Maria talk about health at any size. Maria, thank you.
Okay, so some of what I say tonight you might agree with. Others might be sitting on the fence, maybe you're not so sure, and then others may just flat out disagree. And I just want to highlight and mention that it's all okay. Wherever you're sitting, it's all okay. My purpose tonight is to simply share. To share with you, again, the information, the knowledge that I'm obtaining along the way, but also perhaps to provide you with an alternative approach, perhaps a different way of thinking. Okay? So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to draw your attention to the following images. So without any comments, I invite you to take a look at these images and just make a mental note of what comes up for you. So think about just taking stock of, again, your thoughts and what you might be thinking. Okay? Tonight, we're going to discuss the scientific evidence around health, weight loss, and dieting behaviors. We're also going to investigate the social and psychological effects of focusing on weight. And then I want to explore with you and introduce to you a movement. This movement is called Health at Every Size, and it's a non-diet approach to health. I'll provide you with some background. We'll take a look at the science, because there is lots of science. I want to emphasize that. I'll introduce you to C.H.A.R.G.E, and then what we can do from here. So how do we go about practicing from a non-diet perspective or a non-diet approach? So first, some background. All right. So we hear that the key to weight loss is that the number of calories you take in must not exceed the amount of calories you put out, right? So that's what we hear all the time. But as we know, this isn't a simple equation. What are the current treatments for obesity? Well, we know that there's diet and exercise. We know there are umpteen diet programs out there focusing on weight loss. In fact, I have to share with you this statistic. The North American weight loss and obesity management market was worth $104 billion in the year 2012, and is expected to reach nearly $140 billion by 2017. There are certain drugs on the market which have lots of side effects, haven't been proven to work all that effectively, and particularly with people suffering from heart issues, there have been some pretty serious and fatal side effects. We're hearing lots more about bariatric surgery. Some people have even tried hypnosis, and there might be others that I haven't mentioned here tonight. Okay. Since the mid-'80s, 25 to 55% of people have been dieting, and yet today we're at the height of an obesity epidemic. So what do we know about people who lose weight? Well, you ready for this? We know that 95% of those who lose weight will regain it. We also know that 1/3 to 2/3 of that weight will be regained within a year. Almost all the weight will be regained within 5 years, and 60% of people who lose weight will gain more than they lost. This is well documented in the literature. So we have to remember this statistic because It's been shown over and over and over again. So this is, ladies and gentlemen, the real diet story. We have the before, going on a diet. In the middle, perhaps after, right? Some weight loss may have been experienced. But the after, no one ever really talks about the after. Dr. Bernstein doesn't. Dr. Kuhn, none of them. This is the real diet story. And I think many of us are all too familiar with the dieting trap cycle, as I like to call it. So we starts with a diet, we change the way we're eating. A lot of times that involves severely restricting what we're taking in. And there is a sense of deprivation that goes along with that. We feel we're not part of something, right? Or that we're missing out. That increases and sets us up for cravings. We can only hold out for so long before we give in. And then what are we left with? We're left with a lot of guilt. And then the whole process repeats itself. So what are contributing factors for weight gain? Well, there are many. So take a look. Should I read these out? Or yes? Okay. So there's perhaps a lack of exercise, the quality of the food that we're eating, or the availability of food, genetics, psychological status, menopause, chemicals, toxins. There's some emerging research that suggests that perhaps it's the toxins in our environment that are contributing to obesity. Our environment, medication, cultural norms, beliefs, quitting smoking, socioeconomic status. Endocrine system, again, that's hormonally related. Sleep apnea. Comorbidities, what I mean by that is other health issues, right? So many people are living with more than one health issue that, again, gets in the way. Stress. It's widely known that the primary determinant of health is related to the social and economic environment in which people live. So again, is weight as a marker for health the right focus? So I just want you to keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, so let's take a look at the science. Have you heard of set point? Okay, some of you have. Okay, this is really interesting, and I don't think it gets a lot of attention a lot of the time. So we all know that there are some people who are able to lose weight, right? But why is it so hard to keep that weight off? Well, I'm going to use the analogy of a thermostat. So if you consider how a thermostat works. So you set the thermostat at a temperature where you're comfortable, right? So if the temperature in the room gets hotter or if it gets colder, the thermostat's going to kick in and it's going to adjust itself back to the temperature that you set it at, right? So it just automatically knows. It's got this internal control mechanism happening. The problem is that the more times you jig the thermostat via diet, the whole system starts to break down. Okay. This is a complicated slide and diagram perhaps, but I have to share with you what's happening here and in a particular study that most recently was done. We know that a lot of research has looked at the impact of certain hormones in our system. Okay. You may have heard of leptin and ghrelin. Are those familiar? Some of you have heard. So I'm going to explain what those are. So there was a study performed by Sumithran et al., so Sumithran and his colleagues, in 2011. And they looked at overweight and obese patients who participated in a 10-week weight loss program. Okay, so these people, these folks, were prescribed very low energy diets. So somewhere in the range of like 500 to 600 calories. Very, very restrictive, okay? And it was through liquid nutrition, so people drank a supplement drink, okay? Okay. So the average weight loss that was experienced was approximately 14% of people's initial body weight. Food then was introduced at the end of this 8-week period, and the goal here was to maintain the weight that they had lost. Okay, so that was the final goal. They measured hormones, so leptin and ghrelin. Leptin is the hormone that actually tells us that we're satisfied, we've had enough food. Ghrelin is the hormone that tells us we want food, we need food. So it stimulates appetite, Okay? So these hormone levels were measured along with other peptides and nutrients. These were measured at baseline, so before people started the diet program. They were measured then after the 8-week period, so at 10 weeks it was measured again, so after the diet intervention. And then again at 62 weeks, so just a little over a year, they followed them up just to see, what was happening, okay? They found that the hormone levels changed and adapted as a result of the weight loss that was experienced. So remember I mentioned leptin. They actually found that leptin, that was, again, if we recall, that's the hormone that tells us we're satisfied, okay? They found that leptin levels decrease, so they had less of that hormone. And they also found that ghrelin, remember this is the hormone that stimulates appetite, they found that those levels increase, which is kind of the opposite of what we want, okay? What's more is that they didn't just adapt during the weight loss period. That adaptation in the hormones persisted even at the 1-year mark. And so why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because it just speaks to how difficult it is to not only lose weight, but to keep it off. And that it's not due to a lack of motivation or control that people have. There are some very real and documented physiologic changes that are happening. Okay? It's what we call the yo-yo effect. So, and this is why, going back to my earlier slide, we see people go through that whole diet trap cycle where they go on a diet, they're perhaps successful in the short term, but then it's just too hard to adhere to, and then they go back to the regular patterns of eating, and every time they go on a diet, they go off a diet. Every time that happens, over time, their weight is actually increasing. So the more one diets, ironically, the more weight people gain. 5% success rate. So keeping the weight off after you've lost it, remember, the success rate is 5%. If you knew a drug worked on 5% of the population, would you take it? So why do we still focus on weight? I love this quote. This is from a dietitian out of California, and she says, "A healthy weight is the weight that you achieve when you have a healthy lifestyle." I want to read that again. So, a healthy weight is the weight that you achieve when you have a healthy lifestyle. It's not about the weight, but it's about the behaviors and the habits. A weight that can only be maintained by an unhealthy lifestyle is not a healthy weight. But we see this happen a lot, right? In our attempt to get at a so-called healthier weight, we're losing that battle. So as I mentioned before, and I'll repeat it again, that the difficulty losing and maintaining weight is not due to a lack of motivation or willpower. And this is something that I hear all the time that people report when they come into my office. I guess I'm just lacking the motivation. I guess I'm just don't have enough willpower. Well, in fact, it's a lot more complicated than that. This is how complicated it is. There are consequences, again, focusing on weight. So, I won't go through all the points here, but what I do want to highlight in particular, because many of you participated in our cardiac rehab program, what I want to point out is the increase in cortisol levels, so that's the stress hormone, which we know only promotes ill effects in our system. So when there is weight bias and discrimination, that's my middle point right in there, I really want to highlight that it's the weight bias and discrimination, in my opinion, and again, it's well supported by the literature, it's the weight bias and the weight stigma that is causing harm, not weight on its own. And I'm going to elaborate on that. So you may be familiar with some of these diets. Pardon me. When people focus on the scale, the goal becomes all about that number on the scale. and not about what is truly within people's control. And what is within your control, all of our control, is the habits and the practices that we perform day to day. How much we are able to lose, how much is very different from how much we may want to lose. And so this is, I want to share with you what I experience in my personal practice here, is that, you know, again, people are either encouraged or it's suggested and recommended that they lose weight for health purposes, and so they'll try anything, right, to get to that goal, even if it means compromising their nutritional intake. You might be familiar with many of what is up here. Maybe you're not so familiar with the 5-2 diet. Have you heard of that one before? So what this is people will follow a regular diet for 5 days and then fast for 2. And then the whole process repeats itself until you reach your goal weight. So just think about, again, what people are going through and what they have to achieve in order to achieve that end goal. So here we are again. We have these images. So what do you see when you look at these images? Perhaps a better question is, what do these images force us to think about the people in these images? You might be thinking laziness, or perhaps they don't really care. Ultimately, I think we can all agree that these aren't very flattering pictures. And I'm always amazed and bewildered by how often the media and the diet industry, perhaps sometimes, will show or reveal images of larger sized people that are headless. Do you ever notice that? They're headless. We never get to see their eyes. I always find that intriguing. So if we have certain ideas in our mind, you know, about these images, then perhaps what happens is when we're walking down the streets and we come across a larger sized individual, some of those thoughts may resurface, okay? It might also, and most likely, is unconscious. We don't even know it's happening, but it's because we're so bombarded with so many messages and images every day around, and we hear, I mean, almost every day, we're hearing in the newspaper, on TV, on the radio, there's always some kind of story around overweight and obesity, right? So, you know, it's what I'm saying here is that no wonder we're forced to think this way. It's because our society sets us up to do that. But this is what I'm talking about when I say the weight stigma and the weight discrimination. Because again, when people feel that they have this stigma against them, when they're being judged, they don't seek medical attention. Most people don't. And that's the real concern, because then people aren't being looked after the way perhaps they need to be. Okay? So it's these assumptions and these stereotypes that we make about people are unfair, and it's harmful. So I just want to share with you a few quotes from my clinical practice. Maybe some of these will resonate with you. Maybe you've heard some of your friends, family, others speak to the same tune. One woman mentioned that, you know, it doesn't matter what I eat anymore. Pardon me. Good food or bad, I feel guilty afterwards. And as a dietitian, this really saddens me, because I know, and maybe you know this, I hope you know this, that food is so much more than just the calories it provides or just the fat grams that is in it. There's a huge social, cultural aspect to it. Name one party you've been to where there hasn't been food, right? It brings people together, times of celebration and times of sadness. Food's always there. There's so much more to food than, like I said before, just the calories or the fat grams or the sugar grams that it provides. My doctor doesn't believe me, but I am trying to lose weight. Really, I am. She says I'm eating too much, but my family tells me I'm not eating enough. I hear that a lot. I work so hard, but nothing changes. All my hard work for nothing. So it's not for a lack of motivation. In fact, I think that, you know, particularly those who have stated and mentioned these quotes, actually they're the most motivated clients that I've worked with. And finally, I stopped snacking for 3 weeks. Then I went on a binge. I'm focusing so much on my weight, but all this attention isn't helping. It just isn't working. And you know, it is documented well in the literature that the more focus and attention that is put on weight and scales, the more weight people gain and the less successful they are at maintaining that weight loss if they lose. So, pardon me. Lucy Aframore and Linda Bacon are two researchers who wrote an extensive review paper on the obesity literature. And they highlight some assumptions that are made about weight and fat. Okay, and here's the first one. That weight loss will prolong life. Fat poses significant risk of death. Well, what does the evidence show? The evidence tells us that death increased among those who actually lost weight and who were over 50 years of age. Obesity is associated with longer survival, particularly in those with heart failure, coronary artery disease, peripheral artery disease, kidney disease, and stroke. We're not sure why this is, but there might be some protective component happening there. But it's really interesting to know what the evidence shows versus what we recommend. Next assumption, fat poses significant disease risk. Well, once again, let's go to the evidence. What does the evidence tell us? The evidence tells us that obesity is associated with increased disease risk. And I emphasize the word associated. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But in these studies, when fitness level, activity, nutrient intake, weight cycling, that's the yo-yo effect, right? The up and down on the scales. When socioeconomic status was controlled for, when all these risk factors were controlled for. So what that means is when they were accounted for in the analysis of the study, the increased risk of disease due to obesity disappeared or was significantly reduced. What's an association? Okay, so let's say, for example, that baldness in men is associated with prostate cancer. Okay? Does that mean that baldness causes cancer? In other words, we know that treating baldness won't cure cancer. In the same way, we know that thin people have a lower risk of developing certain diseases. So we see that in the literature, but we can't assume that losing weight will cure those diseases. But we make those assumptions, maybe because we just don't have any other alternative. Very important distinction. It's not causal, it's by association. Okay. We hear a lot about reducing cardiometabolic risk. So it's reducing our risk associated with, our heart health. Well, again, the research tells us that health improvements can be achieved by changing health behaviors, even in the absence of weight loss. So even when there is no weight loss experience, it doesn't mean that people can't achieve or strive or work toward better health. And I love this slide because this study was done by a group of researchers out of Kingston. And the authors show that when no changes occur in weight, and when no changes occur in waist circumference, so that gets a lot of attention too, right? Where you hold your weight or your fat matters. But even when people don't experience any changes in their waist circumference or their weight, but their fitness level increases. So when fitness level increases, that is what decreases the risk of dying and getting other diseases. Let's move on to the health at every size movement. So here it is. Health at every size exists because of the prejudice against extra weight, the prejudice against fat. So this group consists of a team of researchers and dietitians from the UK, many of which, as I mentioned, are dietitians. Their aim is to support people in adopting healthy habits for health and well-being and not for weight control. Okay? Their aim is also to support a reliance on internal cues to eating. So right now you might be wondering, well, what does that mean? I'm going to speak to these internal cues, but essentially it's pretty much relying on what you're feeling inside. So eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're satisfied. Seems pretty simple, not so easy for many of us. Okay? And the Health at Every Size movement also encourages people to accept and respect the natural diversity of body sizes and shapes. Some people are opposed to HAES for various reasons. One reason is that there's this notion that if we don't focus on weight, then people are going to get fat or fatter. So there's this fear, this concern that that's what's going to happen. But I want to make it really clear that HAES recognizes that at any extreme on the spectrum, so if you're too far one way, if you're too far underweight, and if you're too far on the other end of the spectrum, too far overweight where it impacts mobility, breathing, health, like severely, you know, like extremes here, HAES recognizes that neither one of those extremes is healthy. Okay? But when we're talking about overweight and obesity, and there are different stages of obesity, and even using that word, I'm just using it because that's the term that we have. There's so much more that's going on. Just by looking at a person, we can't tell if they're healthy or not. And the problem, again, as I said earlier, is that we make these assumptions about people. But maybe instead of health at every size, it should say health for every size, because I think everybody is deserving of health. All right, so let's talk about the evidence around HAES. And I hope you find this encouraging. So to date, there are 7 randomized controlled trials using this non-diet approach. So participants in the program experience statistically significant improvements in a number of areas. So they looked at blood pressure and blood cholesterol. They saw improvements here. This was I'm referring to, in particular, a 2-year study. They also noticed improvements in health behaviors, so people started to exercise more. Their whole relationship around food and their attitudes around food improved. They measured psychosocial parameters, so things like body image, self-esteem, their mood, and all these parameters improved at the end of 2 years, compared to the control group, which was your traditional diets program. Okay? So when they looked at both groups, the traditional diet program, they too saw improvements initially, again, in cholesterol and blood pressure, of course, activity and what have you. And those in the traditional diet group lost more weight than the HAES group. That was kind of expected, right? By the way, the HAES group, they didn't lose weight and they didn't gain weight. So they actually maintained their weight over the course of the 2-year study. But those in the control group, so yes, they lost more weight at the end of the first year. But when they continued to follow them, at the 2nd year, they found that these folks then had regained their weight. And so also, their psychosocial outcomes, again, their mood, their self-esteem, body image, and how they felt about themselves, those parameters decreased. So they didn't do better in those areas. They actually did worse. And I also want to mention that there was a 50% attrition rate, 50% dropout rate in the diet group. So one might say, okay, so there were more people who dropped out, but really there was no difference between the groups, because at the end of it, you know, maybe they both showed no difference between both groups as far as their weight goes. Well, that might be true if we're just looking at their weights, but I will argue that no, the HAES group did better, because we know that weight cycling, this yo-yo effect of going up and down the scales, we know that's harmful. We know, in fact, that every time we lose weight, yeah, we lose some fat. What else are we losing? We're also losing some muscle mass. And every time we regain the weight, do you think you regain the muscle? No. We only regain the fat. And so I showed you that graph earlier, right, where that trend is, that upward trend as far as weight gain goes. But what isn't talked about, and I want to share it with you here tonight, is that every time people regain and put on that fat again and gain more weight over time, they're actually depositing visceral fat. So that visceral fat is, again, that type of fat that's harmful, that crowds the organs. It's not the fat that you can pinch. That's just subcutaneous fat. That's on the surface. It's the fat that's deep around your organs. And so every time we diet and we go up and down on those scales, That's actually what's happening inside our bodies. And maybe that's what's predisposing us to diabetes, heart disease. Whereas if we just focus on behaviors and adopted a weight-neutral approach, I argue that we'd be better off. So right now, for many of us, the message is if you engage in healthy practices daily, you'll lose weight, and that will improve health. But I want to suggest that we start thinking about the conversations we have with ourselves, we start thinking about the conversations we have with other people, and change that message so that if we're engaging in healthy habits, that will improve health. Your weight will settle in at a place where it's comfortable. Yes, it's true that when people do make changes to their habits, yes, some people do experience some changes, some weight loss. Not everybody does, and I know that working in cardiac rehab. Okay? It's not a bad thing, because what I'm seeing is that people are becoming fitter, they're less short of breath, they're sleeping better, they've got more energy. I could go on and on. They're eating better, they're more conscious and knowledgeable about their food. These are all things to be celebrated. Don't define your success or who you are according to your waist size or your weight. So how do we go about practicing from a non-diet perspective? Well, here are a few suggestions. Instead of counting calories, try listening to your body signals. Eat when you're hungry, stop when you're satisfied. You know, I mentioned earlier, simple concept, right? But I'm seeing some smiles and some chuckles. I know this isn't easy, but it is possible, and I've seen it. How many times do we ignore what our body is telling us, right? I think we've all been there. We do that every now and then, but if it's constant, well, it's first recognizing, being aware of that, because it's only with awareness that transformation can then occur. Instead of exercising to burn calories, how about exercising or moving your body for the enjoyment and pleasure it gives you? And I recognize not everybody finds exercise enjoyable and pleasurable, but sometimes people will report that, you know, when I finish my exercise, I feel great, and actually I'm seeing the benefits as a result of participating in exercise. So the intuitive self. An intuitive eater listens to body knowledge rather than external guides for hunger, fullness, food choices, tastes. So reestablishing yourself as an intuitive eater, it can take some time, and it definitely takes some practice, but as I said before, it's doable. So who do you know that's intuitive? Or what segment of our population throughout the lifespan is intuitive? Children, yeah, and I'll go even earlier than that and say infants, right? Infants, they're intuitive eaters, which means, guess what, folks? We were all infants at one point. So we all have that innate ability to eat intuitively and to be in tune with our bodies. So infants, what do they do when they're hungry? They cry. You know about it, right? And what do they do when they're full? When they're feeding and they're full, what signs do they either spit it up or they pull away, right? Exactly. Okay. So as we get older and as time goes by, we lose that ability to eat intuitively. And my guess is because we're bombarded with information, right? Different messages along the way, and we're hearing from so-called experts on what is the right thing to do, what we should be doing. And while, again, some of that advice can be helpful and useful, I do always want to emphasize that, you know, the knowledge or the information that you receive, remember that a lot of it can and should be probably served as a guideline. It's not a rule for everybody. There isn't, you know, one shoe size doesn't fit all type of thing, right? So we have to be able to look at things critically and always ask questions. So once again, we can practice and retrain ourselves to become intuitive eaters. We just have to trust in our bodies and what we're feeling and experiencing and go with that. And I find that that's the struggle that most people have. So I challenge you. I also believe that through mindfulness, that will also help us along the way. Mindfulness, this is a quote that I've obtained from the Center for Mindful Eating. I have the website there. Deliberately paying attention, non-judgmentally. Very simple concept, but yet again, not so easy. Deliberately paying attention without judgment. I think that's the key component there. And also learning to accept ourselves. I'm just going to read this quote here because, again, I think it's another powerful one. We can't exchange our bodies for a new one, so the best thing is to find peace with the one that we do have. Your body is where you're going to be living for the rest of your life. Isn't it about time you made it home? So accept what is instead of longing for what is not. And that in itself is a challenge. So why am I showing you these different dogs? You wouldn't expect a larger dog, as you see here before you, to become a smaller dog, or vice versa. So my point here is that we all come in different shapes and sizes. It's not bad, it's not good, it is what it is. If we could all just arrive at a place where we accept one another and focus once again for ourselves on what is within our control and our power, and to celebrate our successes, then that will lead us, I think, to peace and harmony and respect. That's it. Okay. Yeah, so your question is that we know that visceral fat, that where we carry our fat can be harmful. And so again, I just want to point out and emphasize that it's the fat that's deep within our abdomen that's crowding the organs. And so there is research that documents that yes, where that fat is placed can be harmful. And so you wanted me to elaborate on how to prevent or avoid that. I think the best thing to do, again, is to focus on habits. Wherever we are right now, it really is about the behaviors that we engage in. And so we hear it all the time. It's the same old message, right? Exercise more, make sure that we're not necessarily more, but exercise consistently, right? Move your body, all of us. And then certainly, the food choices we make, but it goes beyond just food and exercise. It's also about good and proper sleep hygiene. That's huge. That's huge. And there's tons of research that's showing that, people who are living with sleep apnea or who are sleep deprived and have issues around that's a huge component of putting on more visceral fat. So it's all of those risk factors that we talk about so much in our program, right? It's just doing your best to help manage that. Okay, so you have a couple of questions there, and I'm going to do my best to paraphrase, and if I've got it wrong, just set me straight, okay? Your first comment was, so it's about the secret here is healthy habits, and I think you mentioned something about it, it does come down to diet as part of that. And so I just want to clarify for everybody that when you use the word diet, and I think this is what you're referring to, but I just want to make it clear so we're all on the same page, that anytime I use the word diet, I'm referring to our pattern of eating. So it's our way of eating. In fact, the word diet comes from the Greek word dieta. And when you translate that, it actually means a way of living. And I really like that quote, and I share that more and more with people because it's not about deprivation or restriction or suffering, but it really is about an overall pattern of eating. So I think that's what you were alluding to. And then your question, again, was about white meat, right? If we're talking about poultry, and we hear that that's better, and I'll say it is leaner in fat. So you said, how bad is dark meat? Well, for those of you who know me well, I don't use language like good or bad. And the reason for that is because, again, if we are committed to practicing mindfulness, what was one of the operative words in that definition? What stood out for you? Yeah, being non-judgmentally aware, and I really like the word non-judgment. So when we label things like foods, good or bad, we're essentially passing judgment. So what happens when you eat that bad food? What does that say about you? Right? It doesn't make you bad, but we tend to feel bad when we have that piece of cake or whatever it is. And then that's where the guilt comes in, and that's where, again, this whole cycle just perpetuates itself. I know I'm not answering your question. So what I'm getting at here is, sure, your poultry, the chicken breast, right, has less fat in it. It's a leaner source. You're going to get a higher amount of fat in the dark meat. But is it bad? I'll say no. Do you want to include it? Do you prefer it? I'd say go ahead. What you have to look at, and I open this up to everybody, what we all need to do is be mindfully aware of what we're doing as far as our eating habits go throughout the day. And when I say that, I don't mean to be, rigid about it or to overthink it, but be aware, right? Does that help? Mm-hmm. I think the key is balance. Absolutely. I also believe that part of healthy eating includes that cookie or that cake the odd time. That's what I call, well, you call balance. It's what I call flexibility. It's what I call living life and not feeling like you're not a part of something. But it's, again, it comes down to mindfulness. If that cake becomes the main thing that you eat every day, most days, well, then you might want to look at that, because that doesn't fit into the definition of healthy eating. So you say, in your mind, again, you're saying that bad is a synonym for unhealthy. But I actually see those two as very different. So the bad, the good, there is judgment there. With healthy versus unhealthy, that's a fact. I mean, one item may have a higher amount of refined sugar versus another choice. So I think we, especially when we're living with a chronic illness or chronic condition, we do want to be aware of what's in food. And then it comes down to choices, right? It's up to us to make the choice. We're all adults here, right? In my practice, I do not tell people what to eat and what not to eat. I solely provide them with options, choices, and I provide the knowledge and the information based on the evidence of what we know, how certain foods help to improve a certain condition or to prevent a certain condition. It's everywhere, folks. We can't run away from it. It's there, even in your own home if you watch TV, right? Food Network, what have you. There's all kinds of messages that we're bombarded with. We're presented with opportunities to indulge, right, or select certain sugary foods, whatever, right? So you're describing your experience. I always find it interesting, though, and I'm going to challenge you all to start observing and paying attention to the language and the dialogue that you have with yourself, or maybe with others, okay? Because your choice of words was, you have to really have discipline, right, to not buy those foods that you feel you shouldn't have. But what if we approached it differently? What if we approach that counter, and instead of, no, I'm not even going to repeat that, okay? What if we, first of all, and I think this is really important in all seriousness, what if we stopped for a moment, paused, and thought to ourselves that we have choices? And this is all part of coming back to what I was talking about earlier, about focusing on the internal. Okay, and I'm going to elaborate on that. So if we take a step back and recognize that we've got choices that we can make. We could eat that food. We don't have to eat that food. That's your choice. But it's building in that pause and maybe thinking about, okay, so what does this mean, right? So if I have this, what's it going to do for me? How am I going to feel? It might impact your blood sugar, maybe not, whatever the issue is. But my point here is to build in that pause. That pause helps with mindfulness. And I'm not saying that by doing this that we're always going to not make that choice that we don't want to. But instead of thinking that, oh, I shouldn't be having that. Whenever I hear the word should, I think about somebody else out there that's creating the rules for you. But it's not about rules, it's about you making a choice. And if I honestly believe, because we do mindful eating groups in our program, and we really drive home this concept, and it's amazing how, you know, if we start to look at it that way, that we have choices that we can make, it's up to us. And a mindful choice is one that doesn't include guilt. Right? So if you're going to make a choice to eat a certain food, well, then you better enjoy it, because what's the point otherwise? And then choose, like, do you want to be living with that weight of guilt? That's a really heavy burden. So I'm just suggesting approaching things perhaps differently. And when we think about things and recognize that, you know, we have choices that we can make, it starts to feel different inside. So has there been a study done on cardiac rehab patients in particular that followed them over time to see what happened with their weight? I don't know of any such, but what we do know from our program is that there are no changes in terms of weight, right? So for the number of people who lose weight, yeah, half people lose weight, the other half gain it. But I do want to come back to another statistic that I shared with you in the beginning about how the diet industry is, again, predicted to, in the year 2017, is predicted to be worth 104, was that it, or 104? $140 billion. Who's benefiting, folks? Who's benefiting, right? And it's amazing because, you know, in some ways it's brilliant. It's scary because the diet industry is feeding off, literally feeding off, you know, the low self-esteem of people, right? By encouraging people to not be happy with themselves, right? They're actually benefiting from it, and that's why people keep going back. Me? I'm just a dietitian. So your experience is in the evening. Something happens around 9 o'clock in the evening where you get this strong desire to have something salty. Right? So what's happening there? For you, it's salt. For others, it's sugar. For others, it might be fats. Ice cream, yeah. And there's certain foods that we look for. What is happening? Well, I'm afraid I don't have a concrete answer for you. It's very complex. There's a number of things that could be happening. But all I can suggest is, and you also asked, what would be a better alternative? Well, we can probably all think of a better alternative, but is it going to work? Is it going to satisfy that craving for sugar or salt? Usually, vegetables doesn't quite cut it, right? And yes, I've learned that in my practice, okay? So, well, exactly, that's what I'm saying, right? So we can all come up with better alternatives, but is it really going to fulfill the need or the desire that you have at that point in time? And the answer always and usually is no. So what do? Well, what do you think? Any suggestions? You eat 3 chips, okay. And then you stop at 3 chips, and I'd say, wow, okay, others would have a really tough time stopping at 3 chips. You know what, I love that. I love it. I'm going to repeat what you said. So this gentleman, so this gentleman really liked your idea of having the 3 chips. But the difference here is, well, then you take whatever it is that you're craving, right, whatever you're desiring at that time, you take a small amount, and I'm going to add a little bit to what you're saying because now we're on a roll here, right? But I'd say take whatever it is that you have the desire to eat and sit with it without distraction. Eat it mindfully, as this man suggested, so that you're actually tasting and savoring every chip. And I know this might sound kind of fluffy, and maybe some of you have attempted this in the past and it didn't work. Well, you know, mindfulness takes practice. Anybody do meditation? Did you get meditation right off the bat? No, right? So it's a practice. It's a practice. But I do like that idea of taking time rather than eating with distraction, watching the TV, reading the paper, talking on the phone, whatever it is. If you want something and you enjoy it, then sit with it and enjoy it. So how many other people in the room experience the same sensation? Nighttime eating, you get this craving, this desire to eat. Yeah. a good majority, and maybe not everybody put up their hand. So it's a very common phenomenon. Okay, so different things work for different people. So for yourself, you're mentioning how you eat smaller meals and you spread it out throughout the day, and that helps you in the evening. Yeah, so what I want to suggest here is that, you know, we can get all kinds of wonderful ideas and suggestions from everybody in this room, from myself maybe, on the internet, whatever it is. What's important, though, is finding what works for you, but I really encourage you to draw from your own personal experience, so that if you do have a large amount of those chips or a large amount of that ice cream, what was that experience like for you afterwards? How did you feel after you had a large amount of whatever it was? Most people respond that they feel lousy, they feel uncomfortable, they're lethargic. And if that's the case, well then, think about that, perhaps moving forward. And the reason for that is because my hope for people when I work with them is to really help foster a positive relationship with food, to really engage in healthy eating that's enjoyable and not just thinking that everything that tastes good, or sorry, everything that is good or healthy is, you know, is tasteless. Like that's, I think, a huge myth, because I think healthy eating can be quite palatable. But what I'm saying is, by drawing on your own experience, you come to understand or recognize and learn what you want for yourself. Right? So just think about that a bit more and ask yourself, how is it that you want to feel in your body? If you don't like that feeling, then remember that, right? By remembering and honoring your body and respecting yourself, things might be different for you in the future. And know that it's kind of like a push-pull phenomenon here, right? So it might work the first time, it might not work the next time, but recognize that and practice the art of self-compassion, because all too often people really get down on themselves. And by self-compassion, I'm not suggesting, oh, there, you know, go ahead and eat whatever the heck you want. That's not my message, although sometimes it gets misinterpreted. What I'm saying is recognize that this is difficult. It's not easy. But it requires a certain practice, right? Basically what you're saying is that you still have some concerns about the visceral fat. So it's not so much about the external, right, the exterior, but what's happening on the inside. And so it sounds like you're really working hard at the whole lifestyle thing, but you still have some concern around the visceral fat. Well, you know, again, from what we know, and I've showed you those slides, and there are many other studies that tell us that it really comes down to fitness. Right? So how fit you are is going to determine if you're going to live longer and if you're going to live healthier, better quality of life, not your shape or size. And that's the thing, we don't know, because we can't see it, right? That visceral fat is deep within. Typically, maybe, you know, the larger your waist, that there might be more visceral fat there, but unless you get an MRI done, we're not going to know exactly. I want to share with you, when I attended the Canadian Diabetes Association conference. This was many years ago, and there was a researcher there from Quebec who works in cardiac rehab in Quebec, and he showed two slides of an MRI scan, right? So there was one of a woman who was very, very overweight. She had like a BMI of 40, okay, so that's high on the scale, compared to a man who was at a so-called healthy weight, okay? So two screens up, showing the visceral fat of these two people. Guess who had more visceral fat? The thinner fellow. So again, I'm not saying that that's common and that's necessarily, you know, what we are seeing here, but it just speaks to how dangerous it is when we make these assumptions about other people just based on their exterior. We don't know, and there aren't these tests routinely done to know. But you can take comfort in knowing, because we've seen it. When people without medication, right, pre-diabetes, they can prevent the development of diabetes by exercising, eating well, doing all those wonderful things that, you know, many of you folks are doing. And so that in itself is helping with the insulin resistance, which again is all connected with that visceral fat. So take comfort in that.
Maria, Thank you very much.
You're welcome.